It angers me to see armed defenders at the bottom of lost cause statues, adding a renewed threat of violence to icons that are themselves part of an ideology of violence and intimidation. I used slam dunking as a tool for intimidation. T-Mobile USA is one company that uses fear and intimidation to scare workers away from union representation. Over the last decade, at considerable cost to me in money and effort, confronted with ridicule and intimidation, I have brought more than a dozen lawsuits challenging the corruption in the election process in Tennessee. You know, people should be able to vote free of any harassment, intimidation, obstacles, etc. There are many hands touching ballots after a voter drops his ballot into the ballot box. There is no guarantee of ballot secrecy for anyone, which makes the whole system vulnerable to intimidation and bribery. I think I'm decisive, and I like to get things done quickly, so if that comes across as intimidation, I'm sorry to hear it, but it's more in the interest of getting things done. The people who believe in voter intimidation believe that the minute you make a political donation, that you immediately need to turn all your information over to the government. Intimidation, harassment and violence have no place in a democracy. I'm not really well educated, other than an art survey course at the High School of Art and Design in New York when I was, 15. I don't know the history of art, but I got over intimidation from the art world when I realized that I was allowed to feel whatever I want and like whatever I want. Religious minority communities in India have endured incidents of harassment, discrimination, intimidation and violent attacks for decades, often with little hope for justice. We should not have to experience the fear of intimidation or retaliation in the United States. The more you focus on sex without love, and drugs and violence, lifestyle of intimidation and recycling, the less energy you spend on opening up the big tent. Sometimes, I myself, even though I'm in Washington, I go quiet because there is so much intimidation around me. I'm going to feel intimidated whatever, that's just my natural state, so I may as well embrace intimidation. People inspire me. Every day, I meet amazing individuals in the field. When I see a mother who has walked for 3 weeks to come to a MSF clinic, with 2 kids on her back and her belongings on her head, facing intimidation and physical abuse on her way, I am inspired by her resilience, her desire for life. Unions and their supporters in Congress claim that when employees vote on whether to unionize, the elections are tainted by employer intimidation. They're wrong. I never had a slight feeling of intimidation. I'm not even trying to compete with Mr. Perry. I have learnt that bullies use fear and intimidation as their primary weapons. For too long, Governor Cuomo has led with fear, intimidation, and bullying. I have seen how leaders rule by intimidation. Leaders who demonize and dehumanize entire groups of people often do so because they have nothing else to offer. And I have seen how places that stifle the voices and dismiss the potential of their citizens are diminished, how they are less vital, less hopeful, less free. We're looking at all forms of election irregularities, voter fraud, voter registration fraud, voter intimidation, suppression, and looking at the vulnerabilities of the various elections we have in each of the 50 states. The stories of wine lords who trade wine on intimidation or food critics who trade free meals for reviews, those are the stories of my life. I am telling the stories of my life in a true way. Yes, I believe that the art of winning is through intimidation, and not necessarily do you have to speak about it. The allegations against Harvey Weinstein are clearly deplorable. No matter how many great films he's bullied into production, or his guilt-induced contributions to left-minded ideals, this kind of intimidation and abuse of power is perverse and utterly unforgivable. Period. For a century, women have binged on romance novels that encourage them to associate intimidation with infatuation. It's no wonder that this emotional hangover still lingers. Back in those days, intimidation was the greatest tool the drill instructor had. Without that tool, he would not have had control. The freedom to criticize judges and other public officials is necessary to a vibrant democracy. The problem comes when healthy criticism is replaced with more destructive intimidation and sanctions. I always felt that if someone shot me, it would be great for the environmental movement, because they would make me a martyr. Our biggest fear was our children, because there was a tremendous amount of threat and intimidation, and my wife was terrified that the children might be grabbed or assaulted in some way. That was the real fear. The prevailing subtext of every dating book is that beautiful women are surpassingly obtainable, so long as you get over the intimidation that keeps you from approaching them. That's maybe the dumbest advice ever. We have a system that allows us to manage a free and fair election, free of fraud, free of intimidation, and that's what we delivered on election day, and we're very, very proud of it. My father's songs don't intimidate me, my father's songs are my songs. My songs are his songs. There's no intimidation. BDS attempts to use economic tools to boycott Israeli goods and services and punish individuals and entities supporting Israel. It attempts to use harassment and intimidation to turn Israel supporters against the country. The first thing that came to mind when I met Tom Brady was intimidation. I'm showing up in 2005 with a guy who just came off his third Super Bowl win. So, it's a little intimidating walking in the room with Tom Brady for the first time. On its surface, the HBO documentary series, Hard Knocks, about the New York Jets training camp, resembles another HBO series, The Sopranos. Both star the stout patriarch of a New Jersey family preoccupied with food, intimidation, and florid profanity. Intimidation doesn't last very long. Intimidation is an unusual animal. It's a lot about body language and understanding the human psyche, knowing that usually a direct stare will crush most human souls, and that's just the basic gist of it. The soul-crushing stare, the fatherly disappointment, mixed with a little bit of hate and rage, you're on your way. The Klan had used fear, intimidation and murder to brutally oppress over African Americans who sought justice and equality, and it sought to respond to the young workers of the civil rights movement in Mississippi. In the same way, repression and intimidation are not, and never should be, the acceptable companions of reform. The use of threats and intimidation to force energy companies to submit to an extremist agenda may be fitting under a totalitarian regime, but it is never acceptable in the United States. The white man's victory soon became complete by fraud, violence, intimidation and murder. The economics of the security world are all horribly nasty and are largely based on fear, intimidation and blackmail. I don't think ethical people deal with intimidation as a method to achieve success. Undermining someone's self-esteem isn't a method to achieve success. The United States will not tolerate the PRC's, People's Republic of China, violations of our sovereignty and intimidation of our people, just as we have not tolerated the PRC's unfair trade practices, theft of American jobs and other egregious behavior. I've had to deal, a lot, with my own sense of intimidation at meeting famous people, especially actors, but really any famous people. The Obama administration has an undeniable pattern of using regulatory overreach and intimidation to further its political aims. Members of organized crime continue to exploit their victims the old-fashioned way, through violence, threats, and intimidation. As law enforcement has so successfully done before, we will employ our own time-tested techniques to bring them to justice to account for their crimes. The so-called Employee Free Choice Act envisions a world where workers would be denied privacy and forced to vote in an atmosphere of intimidation. In my role as a spokesperson for Amnesty International U.S.A. and as a supporter of various charitable causes including Unlock Iran, a campaign to release prisoners of conscience in Iran, I have never been faced with the threat of intimidation or arrest. Judges must be free from political intervention or intimidation. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.